How's it going, everybody? My name is Clint with Fire Pit Sports, and we are asking the question today, what if? And the question is, what if Bear Bryant had not left the University of Kentucky in 1953? It's a question that gets asked a lot, especially down here by Kentucky fans, because for those of you who don't know, Bear Bryant was a coach at the University of Kentucky for 8 seasons, left in 1953, went to Texas A&M, and then eventually went to Alabama starting in the 1958 season. While he was there, his 8 seasons was highlighted by mainly 2 really big seasons. They won the SEC in 1949, and in 1950, they won the SEC again. Now, 20 years later, the Sagarin rating would actually give them a national championship. And I can't talk about this without bringing up the fact that Kentucky has really leaned into this idea of being national champions in 1950, so much so that they actually made a trophy. They created a trophy that has the national champions on it from 1950. It wasn't handed out in 1950. It was actually given to them in 1970. They probably didn't even know about it for about 10 years. And somebody said, oh, by the way, do you know you won the national championship in 1950? Really? Let's make a trophy for it. You know, that is one of the reasons I kind of get it, because Kentucky has not a lot to celebrate in football. But that would have been different if Bryant had stayed. And that's why I think people ask that question. They see what he did at Alabama, and they want to say, hey, what if he'd have done this at Kentucky? It's almost a no-brainer. You know, people just assume if he had stayed, then he would have done what they did at Kentucky. I agree that that probably would have happened if he had stayed, but I am of the firm belief that regardless of what happened from 1953 until 1957, he still would have left to go to the University of Alabama in 1958. But why did he leave Kentucky in the first place? Well, there's a couple stories. One is the thought that he just didn't think he was going to, do a whole lot at Kentucky. The other is, and this is what I think is more plausible, and this is what I think Paul Feinbaum had said on his radio show, is that when at an athletic banquet, they gave Adolf Rupp a car, and they gave Bryant, I think it was a cigarette lighter. I could be wrong, but he didn't get a car. And Bryant knew at that point that Kentucky was going to be a basketball school. They were always going to put basketball ahead of football. And so he left. And at that point, who would blame him? He wanted to be the top dog. He wanted to be the head, the biggest name on campus. And he had every right to be, considering he was as good of a coach that he was. So when I asked this question, I did my research on the internet, used the Google machine, and found one article by Saturday Down South, which I will actually put in the description of the video. And I also found a clip of an interview that somebody did for the Voice of College Football. Now, in these two, one's an article, one's a video, in these two things, it's really a quick blurb from a guy that they were interviewing on the Voice of College Football. This was obviously, I think this was Kentucky, a Kentucky type broadcast. And he basically just kind of said, hey, what if? That's the big question I always ask. I always wonder what would happen. And he did hold firm that Bryant went, obviously he did say that Bryant would have stayed there. He assumed he would have stayed there for 30 years. Gave a little blurb about that. Saturday Down South actually did something different. They wrote a whole article on it. They predicted that Bryant would never leave Kentucky, like ever. He would be there for as long as he was at Alabama. And they said that based on these two things, that Kentucky would be a dominant team in football and in basketball. So they would turn into what Florida was in like 2006 or 2009, one of those two, where they had won national championships in football and basketball in the same year. Saturday Down South actually thought that would be a possibility multiple times for Kentucky if Bryant had stayed. And they basically said he would do everything at Kentucky that he did at Alabama. Also, the prediction was that Alabama would be kind of a middle-of-the-pack school in the SEC. They would not be able to hire Nick Saban, and that Auburn would actually be the premier school of the state of Alabama. Now, if you're an Alabama fan, that alone is enough to set you off, because just to think that Auburn would be the big team in Alabama, and that the Iron Bowl would just be another game you played at the end of the season, that would be horrible to think about if you're an Alabama fan. But those were what those two articles stated, is that they would he would stay there until and make them Alabama. He would have ended up at Alabama in 1958, without a doubt. But that doesn't mean that if he'd have stayed or he'd gone to Alabama, that Kentucky wouldn't have been any different. I think they would have been very different. I think that Kentucky would resemble more of what we see with LSU than we would with the University of Alabama. And with that, that's what we're going to break into. That's what we're going to talk about. So we start out in this new reality with Bear Bryant staying at the University of Alabama. Staying at the University of Kentucky up until past 1953 and into 1957. Probably has another SEC title or two in those seasons. Maybe he gets an 8-game season in 50, maybe 55, 56. But needless to say, Kentucky is still competitive. Now, Alabama calls him in 57 and he leaves. But what he has done is he has established a program at Kentucky, and by not leaving because Kentucky was always going to be a basketball school, it really didn't give it didn't give Kentucky that label, because I think that a guy like Bryant, for him saying he's leaving because it's always going to be a basketball school, that kind of thing gets around. I see that being something that all other coaches know or would think of as Kentucky, and it's going to keep them from getting a lot of good coaches, as you saw that it did when he labeled them a basketball school. So if he doesn't do that, now they have the opportunity to get coaches or up-and-coming coaches, maybe even hire successful coaches. But what happens, and this is what I kind of see would be interesting, is in 1966, this is where things would start to turn around for the University of Kentucky, because not many people know this, but Howard Schellenberger is actually a Kentucky alum. He played football at Kentucky under Bear Bryant. He coached with Bear Bryant at the University of Alabama. He was actually one of the coaches that helped bring in Joe Namath to the program. But in 1966, Schellenberger goes to the NFL. But what if he doesn't go to the NFL? What if his old school, who's got a competitive team, offers him the job? Bryant would probably tell him at that point, take the job. It's a good school. It's a good job. And if you don't know who Howard Schellenberger is, Howard Schellenberger basically created the University of Miami. He came to Miami in 1979 and turned it into a national powerhouse and won a national championship. I think it was 84 that he won a national championship there. So instead of going to the NFL in 66, Schellenberger goes to the University of Kentucky. Now, in the original history, the 60s and 70s were pretty bleak for Kentucky football. In those entire 2 decades, they only had 3 seasons that saw them win more than 7 games. They had one top 10 finish and 6 top 25 finishes. So this is the 60s and the 70s. 1982 is where they kind of broke out of that funk a little bit. But from the 60s and the 70s, it was bleak. Wouldn't have been that way with Schellenberger, though. I could see him having that team or having Kentucky in the conversation for SEC championships. Maybe he wins a couple of them. But the one thing I think would happen with the Howard Schellenberger era at the University of Kentucky is he would actually try to establish a rivalry with the University of Alabama. Him and Bryant meeting on the field every single season. I think he would do that. I think he puts that into place. And I see the Wildcats under Schellenberger becoming a top 10 school, maybe having multiple top 10 seasons. So obviously in 79, I'm still going to say that he would go to the University of Miami. Miami saw that was a challenge for him. So I think he leaves in 79. So that means from 79 to about 2000, I see Kentucky continuing to bring in recruits, continuing to bring in coaches, because it's now not a basketball school. It's now going to be a legitimate job that you can have. And in the old reality, the 80s and 90s, if you thought the 60s and 70s was bad, the 80s and 90s was even worse. From 1982 until 2006, the University of Kentucky did not win more than 7 games in a single season. No bowls, no top 25 finishes. And I'm going to tell you, as a Tennessee fan, I got to witness the Derek Dooley disaster at the University of Tennessee, and that was only a couple of seasons. I couldn't imagine going through that for 24 years. But in this new reality, even without Schellenberger, Kentucky is a good job. They start investing in their stadium. They start getting in those top recruits from the state of Kentucky. They even bleed into Ohio and Pennsylvania, who's right there. In the 80s, they may win maybe 2 or 3 more SEC titles. I would see them handing Bryant a loss in his final season coaching there in 1982. I see them becoming what Tennessee probably was in the 90s, where Tennessee and Florida was battling for the SEC crown every year. Throw Kentucky in that mix, and now you've got a 3-way battle every year. I see in this scenario, Kentucky may be playing in the very first SEC championship game in 1992, and then maybe they go to again in 94. All that to say this, Kentucky's a legitimate job. They are consistently high in recruiting. They are consistently in the top 10, top 25. And as the 90s wind down in this new reality, Kentucky is looking for ways to put themselves over the top. And they take the chance on a young coach with a strong coaching pedigree, the head coach of the Michigan State Spartans, Nick Saban. Now, Saban was a defensive coordinator for the Browns when Bill Belichick was the coach there. He left in the original history. He left Michigan State to go to LSU. I say this time he goes to Kentucky. And in 2004, they get to win a legitimate national championship and get a trophy to put into that in that trophy room that they have to make. So Saban basically turns that job into what we see with LSU right now. And why do I think that? Number one, I think that Bryant labeled that school as a basketball school when he left. And I think coaches saw that. So maybe this idea of Kentucky being a basketball school, not to mention the fact that the basketball team was an amazing team and probably continued to win. So that would just kind of bring that even more. But what Bryant did was Bryant brought to light that even if they do have a good football coach, even if they have a great football coach, basketball is still king. And so I think if you change that, you change the trajectory of Kentucky football. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what you saw, please hit subscribe, support the channel. You can also follow entire episodes of the Couch Warmers podcast on our website at firepitsports.com, and we are also on Apple and Spotify.